Hi, and welcome to Social Work 670, Grief and Loss Across the Lifespan. So what do you think of when you hear the term grief and loss, when you think about taking this course for the next 7 weeks? Most people tend to think about death and dying when they hear grief and loss. And while we certainly will cover a fair amount of issues related to death and dying in this course, we also want you to think carefully about the many ways that loss and grief are woven throughout our clients' lives in a number of different ways. So first, we're going to think a little bit about how society views things like death and loss. We go to great lengths to avoid thinking about it, to avoid planning for it, and certainly to avoid speaking about it directly. So all of these phrases are different ways that we avoid saying the word die or died or death. So one of the things as social workers that we want to be able to do is to think very closely and carefully about the language that we use and the reasons why we use certain language. So as a social worker, it's important to begin practicing the ability to say, "I'm sorry to hear that your brother died," or "I need to tell you that the family pet is dead," rather than "we lost the dog," or "he was taken from us." And we want to think about the reasons why our clients sometimes talk in this way. Oftentimes it's because this is how society frames things for us, and this is how our families of origin have spoken to us and have taught us how to speak about death. So the Pew Center has done some research about how Americans view death and how we think about death. And you can see here that a little bit more than a quarter of the United States adult population say that they have never given very much thought to death or the type of treatment that they might want at end of life. And so this, I think, speaks volumes about how we view death and care at end of life in our society. We go on to look at some of the differences by race and ethnicity, and you'll see that there are substantial differences across racial and ethnic groups when it comes to personal choices about end-of-life medical treatment. And so think a little bit about what might prompt some of these differences. Possible reasons for these differences could include historic experiences by certain groups in our nation, religious faith, and even potentially family roles within a culture. This slide just gives you a brief overview of the leading causes of death in the United States as of 2015. So as social workers, if we're going to be working in any kind of medical setting, if we're going to be working with individuals who are experiencing loss as it relates to death, either of themselves or family members or loved ones, it's helpful to know the leading causes. So heart disease is still the absolute leading cause of death of Americans, followed by cancer, and you can kind of scroll down and see the remaining. So that was kind of our death overview, and as I mentioned initially, this course is going to always, yes, touch on a little bit of the issues related to death-related losses, but also more globally or more broadly about any type of loss. So it's helpful to start out by just really making some definitions. And what we want to pay attention to is that grief is that reaction. It's that psychological and social reaction to the loss. And what I like about this definition that comes from our textbook is that it specifically states it's a reaction to a loss of someone or something important to us. And when we're working with clients, it's important for us to remember that something important to them is whatever they say it is. So consider some of the things that you may have lost, and some may view as fairly insignificant. I always use the cell phone as an example. It's a phone, right? It can easily be replaced. But think of your cell phone and what that means to you and what that might help you with. For many people, it's a connection. For many people, that's all of their connections. For many of us, all of our photos are on there. Music that's important to us. So yes, to lose a cell phone might seem insignificant, but that might end up being a significant loss for somebody, that's their way of connecting and reaching out to the world. Um, so certainly keeping in mind that that loss has to do with more than just losing a person. It can have to do with many other things, of which we're going to talk about in great length throughout the semester. So bereavement is the objective situation of having lost someone, so kind of that process and overall adaptation to the loss. Whereas mourning talks more about the social expressions and practices that we receive from our society or cultural group. So important just to kind of have a sense starting off of the differences between these definitions and recognize that many people use these terms interchangeably. I want to talk a little bit about varying types of loss and grief. So when we talk about anticipatory grief, that is a form of normal grief, and you'll see normal is in quotes because really what is normal, right? Normal grief related to death could be grief experienced by the dying individual or by caregivers. And when we talk about anticipatory grief, we're talking about, consider a person who has received a terminal diagnosis and they know that they're dying and they're trying to prepare emotionally for that death. That anticipatory grief, they're anticipating that loss. All the various things, loss of relationships, loss of future, all those things that they will lose, as well as the caregivers. So for somebody who's caring for somebody who is terminally ill and they know that they are going to die, that caregiver starts the grieving process while the individual is still alive. It can also be experienced with non-death related loss. So think of somebody who is planning a move. It might be a really exciting time. You're upgrading, you might be moving to a bigger home, you might be moving to a city you've always wanted to live in. You may view it as very positive changes in your life, but it still brings with it a sense of loss, right? You're leaving the place that you've called home behind. You may need to leave some social connections. You may need to leave some of your possessions behind, right? Leaving a job, again, whether it's because you were fired or let go, or whether it's because you've taken on a new position that you've been aspiring towards, it still brings loss with it. Sending a child off to college, both for the family staying back at home and for the child going off to college. You know it's coming and you feel it and you're preparing for it for that entire year that you're planning for it, but you still feel that sense of loss throughout. Another type of loss that we talk about is ambiguous loss. So Pauline Boss talks about two different types of ambiguous loss. So the first is psychological presence with physical absence. And this might be when somebody is truly lost or kidnapped or has run away, has disappeared, but they're kept psychologically present because we haven't known or been told that they're truly gone or that they've died. Um, the second type is physical presence with psychological absence. So this might be when somebody has a dementia or Alzheimer's or even a traumatic brain injury or chronic mental illness or addiction. So the physical person is still with us, but psychologically that persona that we knew them to be is no longer there. And so we still feel that loss. And oftentimes when a loss is complicated by ambiguity, the grief process can tend to be a little bit frozen and stuck. The next type of grief that we're going to talk about is disenfranchised grief. And as this slide indicates, this occurs when grief is not recognized, validated, or supported by the social world of the mourner. And oftentimes that's because the relationship that preceded the death or the loss was not recognized or validated. So some examples that disenfranchised grief is often associated with might be loss related to abortion, loss related to same-sex relationships, an ex-partner or an ex-spouse, parents of adult children who are incarcerated, right? It's hard to talk about your feeling of loss if your child has committed a crime that society views to be fairly heinous, right? So where's that parent to go to for support in their grief? Delayed grief we experience when the quote unquote normal grief is delayed for some extended period of time. And this often occurs when people feel like they don't have time to grieve, or they have a role that they need to remain strong and for other people. So this might happen if you have a young family where one parent dies. The remaining parent may feel like they need to remain strong for the children. They need to demonstrate how to keep moving forward, how to show that everything is quote unquote okay. And so they may not have time to really feel their feelings and deal with their grief in that way. And typically what will happen is that grief will be delayed up until a period of time when it just no longer can be, and it comes out. The last type of grief that I'm going to talk briefly about, and only briefly because we're going to address this further in week 2, is normal grief versus complicated grief. So we've talked throughout this PowerPoint that grief is a normal reaction to loss. And what we know about it is that grief is complex and very much an individualized process. So how do we know, or who is to say when grief is normal versus complicated? So our text defines complicated grief as a long-term persistence of symptoms of separation, distress, and feelings of being devastated and traumatized by the death. Now, again, we're going to talk more fully about this in next week's readings and discussions, but it's important to know as social workers, when we're dealing with individuals experiencing loss, when we may need to refer them on for additional counseling, when their grief is really impacting their ability to function, versus this quote unquote normal grieving that we see people go through in an ongoing fluid process. So this was just a little bit of an overview of the various types of grief and loss. You may want to refer back to this in this course throughout as we look at different cases, and you'll be asked to identify what type of loss you're seeing or what type of grief response you might be seeing. So that's a little hint for you that you might want to keep this one handy. Thanks so much for your interest.